you ever nailed the big shapes in a sketch, then relaxed and think, oh, that's the hard part over, only to ruin the whole thing with one tiny little detail? Confession, that's exactly what I did last weekend, and I'll show you that in a minute. Maybe it's a chimney that's leaning the wrong way, or a fence that doesn't match the perspective, or even just if the colours bleed into each other when you didn't want them to. I'm going to go over some of the small things that can wreck an otherwise fantastic sketch. And I use the word wreck loosely. I mean, we were our own worst critics, and these things probably aren't as noticeable to other people. But even so, to make us feel better about our finished work, I'm going to go over some of the little details that can make or break a sketch, and hopefully help you to avoid them so that your drawings stay strong to the final brushstroke. So in the video I posted last week, we focused on breaking down the house into its large shapes. Doesn't matter if you haven't seen that video, I will put a link up in case you want to watch it, but this will apply to a sketch of any building. And breaking it down to big shapes does help us get it 80% right, but it's that last 20%, those final little details, that can make or break it. And a friend of mine actually pointed out something really important. And she said that she still didn't really know how to get the chimneys and the fence and the garden path right. There were some other questions in the comments as well, and I'm also going to address those. But my friend's absolutely right, and they're the first things that we're going to look at today. It was an elevation view of a property, so looking at it front on, so that we didn't have to go too deeply into perspective. But of course, the things like the chimneys and the fence were at the sides of the building, so we could see them at an angle, and we need to know a little bit about perspective to get those looking right. And this is exactly what happened when I was out last week sketching. I was sketching a gallery with two adjoining cottages, and I broke my own unwritten rule. I have an unwritten rule that if a car is in the way, if I can guess what's behind it and draw it without seeing it, so if it's, for example, just a plain brick wall, like here, or here where it was some flowers, I can draw those things without being able to see them. So I don't put the car in. The car might move away, the car's not my focal point, and the car might become the focal point if I draw it really badly. But if the car's blocking something and I can't really guess how to draw it or what it is, I put the car in. I might leave it white so that it doesn't take up too much of the attention from the buildings, like I have here, sort of ghost cars if you like, because I couldn't see behind them, I couldn't always guess, so I put them in but didn't draw too much attention to them. But in this particular case, I didn't put the car in, I guessed, and I got it completely wrong. There were some brick steps and a garden wall, and the perspective just looks terrible, and when I look at the picture, that's all I see. So to try to help you to avoid any annoying little niggles at the end of your picture because of perspective, let's dive right in and look at perspective in a way that you can actually apply it. So thanks to my friend, I've got a mock-up here that combines her chimneys and the garden fence with my original sketch. What went wrong and how can we put it right? The first thing that I noticed was that this line was going up instead of down, and that's a surprisingly easy mistake to make. I've often found that my brain overrides my eyes and I see something as sloping in the wrong direction. I did it here. I don't quite know what I was thinking, but that roof looks absolutely terrible. So I now do make a point of holding a pencil up and I just check which way it slopes. The next thing is the perspective. Like any angle, you can use the clock face trick to try and visualise the angles better. When you've got something like this where you've got two chimneys that have got to match up with each other as well, that makes it a bit more tricky. And that's when it's probably sensible to just apply some of the rules of perspective. So the rules of perspective state that all parallel lines meet at the same vanishing point. And a simple way to show what that means is by looking at this house from above, an aerial view, and we can see that the sides of the chimney and the fence and the path are all parallel. So when we're looking at the house from eye level, those lines will all meet at the same vanishing point. It's easy to find your eye level if you're looking at something like this picture here, because you can see that all the lines that are above your eye level slope down and all the ones below your eye level slope up. And any that look horizontal are on your eye level, which is also known as the horizon line. And these lines all meet at the vanishing point. So if I extend all these lines, you can see where the vanishing point is. And all these parallel lines will meet at it. So that's the insides of the chimneys, the fence, and even the garden path. And if you try to keep that in mind when you're drawing these things, it should help you to get the angles right and to make them look believable. If you're not working from a photo, then obviously it's a bit harder to do, but you can take a photo of what you're drawing and use the markup tool in the photo app to extend those lines. And it's something that the more you do it, you'll get gradually better at it, and you'll kind of do it without thinking too much. I've actually got a video that goes into this in a lot more detail. I'll put a link up in case you're interested in watching that. Another question I was asked in the comments was how I apply the paint. Specifically, am I working wet on wet, wet on dry? And to be honest, it varies immensely. It varies whether I'm working inside or out, on the weather, the humidity, the temperature, how much time I've got. But I'll just show you a few examples of some of the things that I do in certain circumstances. On the sketch I did in the video last week, I didn't want the rendered part of the building and the brickwork to blend into each other completely. But on the other hand, I didn't necessarily want it to be a completely dead straight line. So in that situation, I'll leave a tiny gap. I won't deliberately wait for one section to dry before I start on the other. And if there's a little bit of bleed, I don't mind, it adds a bit of character. But the two sections will remain mainly distinct. On this sketch that I mentioned earlier that I did last weekend on plein air, it was a very damp, drizzly day, so my paint was still very wet when I painted these neighbouring houses, and they did actually bleed into each other, and I really like how that's turned out. To be honest, it was more luck than judgment, but that's the fun of watercolour really, isn't it? In some areas where I like a bit of movement and like it to be quite loose, sometimes I will dip my brush into a slightly different colour each time I reload it. So for example, if I'm doing a brick wall and I've made a mixture of a brown with maybe a little Payne's grey, each time I dip my brush, I might dip it in a bit more Payne's grey, and the next time add a little more of the brown, and then I might add a little red to that, and so on, just to keep it slightly different over a big area. And another thing I like to do is, with a wet on wet technique, add just a little bit of Payne's grey to the wet brick wall. So just some little drops, so you get some areas that are a little bit darker than others. Brick walls aren't exactly the same colour across the board, so it's just nice to vary it a little bit, and it just gives it a bit more of a natural look. Now if I want to make sure that I don't get any bleed at all, then I will wait for one section to be completely dry before I start painting the neighbouring section. A good example of this would be the sky, where I don't want anything else to bleed into that blue, grey. Another area where I find it's quite important to leave it dry is when you're adding shadows. If the paper's still wet, then it will just absorb the darker colour that you're trying to put the shadow on with, and you just end up with a wishy-washy, insipid look. So if you want a deep dark shadow, I find it is better to let it dry first and do wet on dry. And then finally, when an area like, for example, my brick wall is completely dry, I might add some random strokes of other colours just to layer it up a bit and give it that sort of sketchy feel. And the final point that I was asked about in the comments was about how I applied the sky itself and why I put down the clean water first before I added the paint. Well, this was to try to make it look more natural, more organic. If you put the plain water down first and then just drop some blue into it, it can freely flow without having to actually paint it on yourself, so to speak, which can end up looking a bit too neat or a bit too contrived. I always used to do my skies like this until one day an instructor told me that having a random shape detracted from the rest of the sketch and kind of got me to square things off a little bit. And I did this for a while and I just felt that it was ruining my sketches. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that technique. I just found that for my style, it didn't look right. So I've gone back to doing it this way, and I do feel that it looks better, but that's just personal opinion, and you might prefer to square yours off. But if you do try doing it this way, it's really important to make sure that your brush and your water are both completely clean. And once I've put the sky on like this, I find that it's usually best to just leave it alone. Don't mess with it. If there's a bit that you don't like, tough. And to be honest, once it's dried, it'll probably look all right. Well, I hope that's been useful, and I do really appreciate the questions and the feedback in the comments. And if you've got any questions, then I'm happy to try and answer them either in the comments or in another video. If I can't answer them, then you have to ask someone else. Anyway, thanks for watching and happy sketching.